Cool, and I'll share here in a bit, but I'm gonna just kind of introduce because this is gonna be slightly or very different from what I was originally planning, not in terms of what I'm actually gonna say, but just probably less overall. Because I've been very busy, surprisingly, in the last couple weeks. But that busyness has driven home um one of the motivating problems for this talk. Um, so just kind of big picture real quick. If I had figured out the bot situation, I would have renamed this a little bit earlier, but the this is now kind of one of three presentations I want to put together going forward on trying to flesh out a theory of social information in terms of our overall technological point of view. We have ideas about social worlds and social mediation and social modes, social space-time. And so within that context, and with the goal of building it up rigorously, I've been thinking a lot about information. Um, so in that context, I'm going to be kind of looking at, and I think this speaks to Gabriel and Raphael's points, which I'll touch on in just a second. Um, but this is I'm going to attempt to kind of lay out what I think are conceptual semantic approaches to social mediation and social modes before I get into mode B that I think are kind of us staking out a way to interpret our work uh, with the goal of building kind of mathematical rigor there. Um, so as a setup, and in the spirit of, boldly ambitious STP claims, doesn't even feel ambitious anymore to make ambitious claims. It just feels like that's just part of a presentation now. Um, but we've been talking a lot about modes A and mode C. So just, I think everyone here is on that, but just to be clear, by modes A and mode C, we mean the logics of gift exchange and commodity exchange. Logics which have, since Marx and Mauss, had a pretty rigorous and consistent logic to them that have been able to be used as the basis of building up uh, very sophisticated conceptual cognitive mappings of different aspects of society. My proposal is that that has not yet been accomplished in mode B. So part of the issue we've had up until now is we have been using what I would call metaphysical notions um, prior to having developed an atomic logic of mode B. So in the case of modes A and mode C, we had the benefit of the kind of like algebra, if you will, kind of having been mapped out, and then doing the work of translating that into categorical and topological terms. But I don't think we've even had that with mode B, which is part of the problem we've had in attempting to formulate it. But I would also say, and this is the main motive, I would go beyond that and say that's part of the problem we've also had organizationally. So one of our kind of fundamental stakes in all of this is that our theory is supposed to be able to be transitive between a kind of structural critical analysis of the world in which we live and that we're trying to transform, and in which more or less we are existing against, and which is against us, and transitive to the actual left-wing political organizing that we do. We want a theory that's going to be able to move between those two areas without fundamentally transforming the core theoretical commitments. Obviously, they would apply differently, or there might be different things that you do to make them work, but those would be questions of application of a theory, not fundamental tenets of the theory changing. And I think when we look at the way problems have been addressed so far, and the way that problems have been formulated, a lot of what we've been looking at has been articulating the question of one of two things, I think. One, we have tried to solve problems, and I think been making steps towards solving problems in the sense of evening and distributing labor, right? In fact, this was Raphael's kind of original and kind of main motivation when we were talking about both the time and money spent by a handful of comrades in this group, as opposed to the total labor that's been, or the total output of the organization in terms of basic reproductive labor. Um, and these are kind of like input output conceptions of how we use our time. They're very much based upon mode C, right? Like, how do we break up the composition of STP in such a way that we can kind of see how much time it takes to keep it going and then kind of distribute that more fairly, more evenly. The other thing we've been working on is attempting to develop the like community connections of this group in such a way that we're developing more rigorous comrade friend connections without kind of the self-enclosure and the negativity and the toxicity that comes with the cliquishness on the left, which I think we're probably all more than familiar with. And in fact, I can say on both ends of both, like having had issues and working through them, and then working with other comrades that are having had issues, that the kind of community connections in this group have been a big part of my life for the past few years, and I know have been a big part not only of individuals' lives, but of the of constituting the space in which problems for STP have been formulated, right? Like realistically, a lot of the places where STP problems have been talked over have been in discussions of like an informal friend variety. Um, and you could say like our problems have been kind of almost broken up and digested in these different pockets and then brought back to the group to kind of fully kind of work through. And so I think it's not as simple as, oh, we just don't have a nice theory, so that's not why it works this way. But I think that there's an overlapping set of reasons why we can kind of more intuitively define problems in terms of modes A and mode C. But we've had a particular issue precisely in trying to come up with like an actual rule-based or role-based structure, right? Like our attempts to create specific kind of administrator roles haven't really worked. Our attempts to kind of create specific feedback kind of check methods to make sure certain jobs get done haven't really worked. Funding hasn't really taken off yet. And this isn't to say that like these are huge things that are just like going to be impossible to solve and won't require some like just a little more attention or whatever, but rather that I don't think we've had the adequate kind of like framework to translate problems of this nature into our theory, because I think that we haven't had a sufficiently abstract notion of mode B to be able to formulate our problems. I think that the proposal I'm going to make as far as mode B, which I'm going to just go ahead and put out, is logics of control and protocol exchange, and I'll explain why obviously here in a bit, are an attempt to put mode B into its proper abstract place so that we can solve problems transitively, both in terms of understanding how things work, especially our theory of the state, and in terms of addressing problems of an organizational variety that deal with what I'm going to call like the mode B kind of problems. Actually, I said that like I was gonna have more to say, but I think that actually wraps it up. So, that's the kind of those are the kind of stakes there. Is I think that we're gonna be able to get a better theoretical grasp of, you know, when we're trying to account for theories of the state, as well as a better approach to kind of tying the mathematics together. But even more importantly for me, I think as much as I really want the theory to like look great on paper and all that, is I think that there are important dimensions of a kind of like the social problem solving logics that we're exploring in terms of the three modes that we still have to kind of like tease out. So it's in that spirit that we're going to now move on into screen share mode. Alrighty. Alrighty. You see a Figma? Okay. So I'll just go ahead and put the terrible, terrible math right up from the get-go. And I'm sorry, like I said, I don't have a lot of presentation. I really wanted to have more like interesting stuff than what I have before you today. But I can promise you that the implications of what I have right in front of you are super interesting. You just got to give me a second to like lay it all out. So, this is in a sense like the exact opposite direction of Raphael's presentation 2 weeks ago. Raphael kind of zoomed out from our typical triangle to look at the whole big picture. I'm zooming in to look just at what in our mediation diagram would be arrow 1 from the individual to the world. There is no politics at this stage that you can see right now. So the first question I'm kind of looking at is, you could say, what makes just the social, right? I think that that would be like a useful question to frame everything I'm going to say today. If we're going to define the political as something that is different than the kind of standard relationship along this line between the individual and the world, what is it about that line that has to be broken? What constraints have to be overcome? What kind of like sameness has to be ruptured in order for politics as such to emerge? The idea that I'm drawing from here is from the mathematician William Levere, who argued that these strange little things called adjoints should be put at the center of logic and trying to understand, I mean, kind of everything. Like, he argues that adjoints are essentially models for dialectics. He uses adjoint functors to develop his elementary topos theory, which is pretty much everything we've ever read about toposes is actually much more Levere's topos than Grothendieck's in a lot of ways. Like, the very nice, neat, logical toposes that we've been dealing with are products of his work, and he used adjunctions to systematize. For him, adjunctions are a way to organize mathematical objects and structures in a way to make sure that the system actually does what you want it to do. And when I say does what you want it to do, I mean that not just in the sense that you can prove the things you want, but Levere was actually came from a very applied practical mathematics background. A lot of his critiques of set theory, which I'll get into the next presentation when I focus more on math, were that you could show that things were the same, but it was a big pain in the ass. And for him, category theory was not only logically more sound, but it was also just a lot easier to do things in category theory. So what exactly then is an adjunction, right? So you follow my arrow. This symbol right here is the adjoint symbol, and you can read it as C is left adjoint to R, or R is right adjoint to C. We have the same thing over here with R and I. And of course, in terms of our diagram, this means composition, this means reduction, and this means interaction. So we'd say that composition is left adjoint to reduction, and reduction is left adjoint to interaction. And what that means, like mathematically, how that's defined is these constructions right here. This line means if and only if, right? So that means that you can only have this being true when this is true. And what this means is, so this is your left-hand side adjoint, and this is your right-hand side adjoint. What this means in terms of interpretation is that if you leave from the individual and go to C, in other words, if you look at how the individual is composed in terms of the world, it will always be bound by the world to the degree that the individual itself is always bound by a reduction back from the world. And likewise with this. So what exactly would that mean? So if we're thinking about like the arrows into the world here, we got composition, we got interaction. That would mean like interpreting how the world is built insofar as it's composed not just of an individual, but of the category of individuals, all the individuals which again, in our kind of like overall social theory, may not even be individual humans at this point. There's a lot of different ways we can interpret that. So we're just going to keep this generic at this point to individuals. But what this means is that if we look at how at any given point the world is composed by some individual, that composition will never be bigger than what the world has to offer in general, right? Like, so in other words, composition is a bottom level limit. It gives like something can be more complex than your compositional bottom, but it can't be less complex. So that would entail something like if you were to bring together all the pieces to build a house, once you've put all those pieces together and you've got a house that's working, you'd then be able to figure out all kinds of interesting things to do in that house. You could throw parties, you could live there, you could rent it out, you could keep it empty and just admire it from a distance and paint it. The point is that the house will always be able to exceed what particular compositions you have. But if the composition no longer holds together all the parts anymore, you'll no longer be able to get any of those things from out of it. Gabriel?
Yeah, I just want to.
Please ask me clarifying questions because
No, it's just even before clarifying. It's just because I think that uh, perhaps I'm wrong here. I'm remembering wrong, but in our diagram, just to confirm, like, let's say you have here the individual and the world. I think that interaction and constraint went in inverse directions, right? Doesn't this go in the inverse direction of this?
Well, that was constraint generally. I thought we were using C for the composition at this point,
Ah,
how it's
okay.
composed. Yeah.
Okay. So,
Yeah, sorry, that C is in composition,
yeah,
not
which
constraint.
actually makes we even could make the sense that constraint is this direction where you are in the whole, and composition is in this direction.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Perhaps. I mean, so just to clarify, so I'm following because
Yeah,
I
yeah. So there's different ways. Yeah. Yeah. So just to reiterate, this is based upon C is in composition. So looking at how any given individuals are composed into a world, how given individuals are interacting in a world, and how the world is reduced for any given individual or subset of individuals.
So C is almost like, because the constraint is almost a way that we define the inverse of belonging in the much looser categorical sense, not set straight, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but in the sense of composition, in the sense of you would write exactly as you did, right? That an element belongs to a set, but in the way that we put out the arrows, it was as if the set constrains the element, right? If you belong to S, then you're under certain property, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying is, well, but I'm talking about this arrow as kind of the grammar is the same. It's about composition. It's about what belongs to what and how, but you're just
Mm-hmm.
writing it the other way, which is perhaps even more intuitive than our constraint arrow, right?
Yeah, and I think like when you look at membership arrows, you have arrows from the one into an element to pull set out the member. So it's kind of following that idea,
Sure,
but it's
sure.
also following the idea that these things called adjoint triples appear a lot, like all over the place. Like for example, in the Spivak Fong essay on Mariology, at the center of how like constraints operate, their whole theory of constraints uses an adjoint triple because that's how the quantifiers are set up. I had that pulled up, but I'm not going to try to find it right now. The point, but I think what's interesting about the adjoints is it gives us a way to think about constraints, not in terms of the individual pieces, but in terms of their interaction, in terms of how they relate to one another. I'll try not to use interaction separately, but in terms of how the three
Behave.
different kinds of constraints interrelate to one another are the actual constraints, right? So we could kind of interpret it this way, right? That because these are if and only if. So in other words, we could say if the world is always going to provide more than what the pieces of it add up to, then the individual will always be bound by what the world is reduced down to into them, right? So and again, we're trying to think about here specifically a society without politics. So if it sounds like that's too constraining, it should be, right? It should feel that way. Then when we go over here, we have a similar issue, right? We're saying here that now suddenly the individual is more open than the reductions they get from the world. Suddenly the maps they get from the world are not, they can be bigger than that, but only if the world itself is bound above by all the interactions of individuals that make up the world. So in both cases, we have one kind of openness. In other words, we have a case where the world can be bigger than its composition, and an individual can be bigger than the reductions it gets from the world, but only to the degree that the individual and the world are constrained from the other direction. So we have a kind of way that we can start to conceive of how, for example, innovation, change, social development, quote unquote, can happen under a social world, under capitalism, for example, without ever having any real changes that occur in like a political fashion. Because any, for example, changes here in the size of the world, maybe some new technology is introduced, that will only happen to the degree that individuals are constrained precisely by the reductions from that world. We're seeing that, for example, right now with the proliferation of AI, right? To the degree that AI makes the technological world a bigger place, individual workers are being all the more proletarianized and made into workers as such, right? Likewise, to the degree to which you're able to kind of grow beyond or have space to be more than just the reductions of the world, right? The world itself becomes constrained by the interactions, right? So again, kind of think about this in terms of like the professional world, quote unquote. You might be able to like expand your resume, you might be able to like kind of get more trainings or whatever, but the actual world of business, the actual world of profession is always going to be constrained by like what everyone else is doing. There's no actual space to create newness. There's no actual place to do the thing that you want to do or that you feel is necessary. So, and you have these kind of like two-way bindings that make adjoints such a powerful means of describing constraints. As one thing opens, the other thing gets more tied down. Now, on top of that, we can see that since these are both adjoint at the same time, because these are triples, we know that if this is true, and this is true, and then both these are true, that means that we have the individual is equal to the reductions of the world, because we have less than and then larger than. Which tells us something interesting as well, namely that if the world is capable of being larger than the sum of its parts, but will never be larger than the sum of its interactions, the individual is equal to their reduction from the world. So we actually have here a way to start to think about how, at least from the perspective of individuals, they can stay the same size, right? One of our kind of, I think, interesting implications from Raphael's work was that the ability for a world to get bigger and smaller is actually very kind of present. It's very kind of, it's imminent to a world itself. So then we have to, in other words, change in size of world is actually generic. Oh, keeping the world the same size is a problem from the perspective of the social. So how is it that a world stays the same size? Well, if you're able to get both of these constraints in place, you're able to lock in the size of an individual. That in turn then gives us upper and lower boundaries on the size of a world. And what I'm proposing is if we follow this interpretation, we then designate that this is what it means when we say that 1 is equal to 3 and 2. In other words, that politics hasn't been done through an organization. We haven't provided a kind of order-based intrinsic definition of what that equation would mean. And so this is an attempt to say if the world is always bound between its compositional and its interactive components, then the world, even though it's not staying the same size, is staying within the limits that makes it so that the social composes with the organizational, and politics does not occur. So this would give us a way. It also, it does follow a certain degree of philosophical logic as far or structure as well, because I think, and I'm not gonna stick to this because this is kind of just a my own crazy love of German idealists, but I think you can make a case that this split also accounts to a certain degree for why in Kant you have to have a distinction between pure and practical reason on such a profound level. Because you could look on the left here is precisely the problem of pure reason, that you have here the categories in terms of what actually makes up an object, and that provides the base for which the world of experience and perception can provide more information than just those categories. However, the individual as a transcendental subject is limited precisely by their capacity to schematize and reduce down that information in the terms of pure reason. Over here, we now have the individuals capable of going beyond the reductions from a world. In other words, when we are able to infer some kind of ethical imperative, we then have the ability to kind of go beyond our circumstances. But, and this is much more based off of critique of practical reason than pure reason. But in Kant's categories of practical reason, they're all based on this very weird kind of like almost social psychology categories. It's weird, and almost I haven't seen a lot written on it actually. It's a strange chapter of his work. But essentially he has this thing in the Critique of Practical Reason that he calls the logic of archetypes and ectypes, where he argues that the way that you learn how to implement a categorical imperative is through a complex system of role modeling. So even though he has this kind of like ruptural theory of ethics, the only way to implement ethics for Kant is actually by emulating the relationships that already exist around you. So in both cases, you have like this kind of fundamental split down the middle, and two different ways in which reductions, which can also be in this sense because we're talking about cognitive mappings. We could also think of it as small r reason to a certain extent. We have it in two different places with regards to the individual. One is it's binding the individual to the degree that it is showing how the world is open. And the other is it's giving the space for an individual to act, but only insofar as that those actions make sense in a already complete network of other people's actions. So if we take this as what politics means, we could then move on and try to replicate the move that we've done in terms of the arrow inside of this. So last time we've developed, as well as the diagram as a whole, we developed a way to interpret what happens when you reverse this arrow, right? Which we've had as what it is to be a right wing, right? You're trying to make the world a smaller place, but not only trying to make the world a smaller place, you're trying to essentially reduce the world to the individual. But let's leave that aside for a second. Instead, what I propose is that when we try to understand classic bourgeois ideology or liberal centrist ideology, it very much keeps the same ordering of arrows that we have here, which is why, to a certain extent, liberals and leftists can agree at least on baseline terms about reality and physics and things that the right wing rejects even those kind of coordinates. But it does flip, except instead of flipping the arrows, it flips the adjoint relationships between them. So instead of composition is left adjoint to reduction, is left adjoint to interaction, you now have interaction left adjoint to reduction to composition, right? Which, to skip all the math down to the bottom, would mean that the world is bound below by the sum total of human interactions and bound above by the composition And in both cases, it would be the interactions based upon people's assessments of the world and the composition based upon the kind of reductions from the world. And so you can actually see pretty neatly how this would fit in. You have the idea of rational decision makers. Out of those rational decision makers, they make like a nice little world. But that world is, as we know, every time election season comes around, ultimately bound by the composition of the parts. You can never have a world that's bigger than the parts. You can only ever learn to better or worse kind of maneuver within that. But beyond that, I think this actually goes to the heart of Marx's definition of bourgeois ideology at the end of, I always forget if it's part 1 or 2, but it's in volume 1, when he says that bourgeois ideology is essentially what happens when you treat circulation as opposed to production as the cause of everything. And he says very literally, it just inverts the relationships here. So I would propose that this is what that inversion is that you are literally flipping backwards how these constraints look and then acting accordingly. And so we have a way to understand not only how a world can kind of change size and adapt to change to different circumstances while still remaining apolitical, but how within that, without having to move the arrows and break the overall direction, you can enable a kind of misinterpretation through this flipping of the adjoint relationships. So that's the basic idea of adjoint semantics. They give us a way to model constraints, not by locking things in exactly, but by giving us a notion of how a particular universe of objects or a particular kind of structure can change size, can change the amount of complexity, while still more or less having like remaining itself, right? Like we're concerned with something still being capitalism, but it changes a little bit here and there, or quite a bit even, right? Like if we look at the neoliberal reaction that went through thoroughgoing transformation of the entire capitalist system, right? And so we'd want to look at, for example, if we were to do a history of neoliberalism according to this statement right here, what we'd have to recover is asking the question of, first off, what is neoliberalism reacting to? It's reacting to a place where this is broken. So if that's broken, that means you have circumstances where, for example, the world is not as big as the pieces that make it up anymore. Individuals are not bound in the same way. The world is getting bigger than the interactions of people. So then you have to adjust those scales again. You have to kind of slide up and down until you're able to re-establish a world that is bounded above and below. So in the case of neoliberalism, we can talk about how computerization was used to reintegrate the global economy and to take stock of all the parts, right? Like a lot of the reason we have this amazing computer technology today was capitalism was deeply concerned with keeping track of all the little pieces. As it learned to keep track of all those little pieces, it was able to then make sure it could extract as much value and therefore increase the productivity of the world from the basis of those pieces. But at the same time, it was able to use the reconstruction of institutions through neoliberalism to reestablish the sum total of human interactions as the like limiting above of the world as well. So it gives us, because obviously like we have two kind of basic problems once you organize this like in this direction, which is one, how do you break this so that you do have a rupture and you have politics? And two, if politics is a problem that the ruling class or whatever you want to call it wants to get rid of, how do you reestablish this so that politics is made invisible and erased from the social? So this is an example. Saunders Mac Lane, who's one of the the granddaddies of category theory, said adjoint functors arise everywhere. So even if this in and of itself is not the end all be all of how to do this, if our theory doesn't have adjoints, that's one of those things a mathematician wouldn't take seriously. If we don't have those doing important work in our theory is not a mathematical theory yet from like a rigorous standpoint. Um, so this is an attempt to do so while still kind of parameterizing it on terms that make sense from our theory. We're wanting to know what it means to break this equation. Once we do that, we then kind of move into all the territory that Raphael's talk brought last time. So with that in mind, I want to focus on Dennis. Go ahead.
Oh,
This other terrible
should we leave our
diagram.
questions for the end, or can I?
I'm good with whatever. I realize this is kind of probably even by my standards vague, so I'm happy to clarify as I go along.
Okay. Well, yeah, I actually I love this, and I think it's like exactly the right direction we should be going. I was just thinking about like maybe some more concrete examples or more like more semantic content to these things to maybe help everyone and myself too to understand the meaning of the different maps and stuff. So I was thinking like, what if W is the space of constraints of the world, and they're actual constraints, right? They're like materially bound and like they're not something you can subjectively negotiate with. They're in some sense set. And then I would be the space of reasons. So the things that we are able to ascertain about why things are the way they are, why people behave the way they are, why or why people behave the way they do, and why we do the things that we do. So R would be a map that takes the space of real constraints and maps them into the space of reason. So then, makes sense. Like I do the things that I do, because I think there's some reality to that, but that's not necessarily true. Things are reduced for me, right? So my life world is not equal to the world if there's a reduction happening. Then what you're proposing is that there are two arrows that are the adjoints I and C, I being so here I'm interested in what we could say about I and C semantically, because it's almost like I takes reasons that I have and maps them back into the world in terms of things I can actually do in the world. So I might have a lot of reasons for what I do, but not all those reasons actually yield a concrete action. Like I say, I'm a leftist, but maybe there's no act. Like I'm not part of any organization. I'm not doing anything. So then that mapping from my reasons to the actions is very poor, right? So that's one way of thinking that I arrow, and then C would be, and I think this one is a bit unclear for me, but C is something like where I am in the world. So like, I might think I am, a man of the people, or a, fighting for this or that. But depending on how we consider the C mapping, I might actually exist in a very isolated place without many connections, or I might be more connected than I know, right? More integrated into parts of the world than I realize, relative to the space of reasons that I occupy and that I have for myself. Does that make sense? Like this interpretation of
Yeah,
IWIRC arrows?
that makes sense. And I think that also because one person who I think we should really, I know people we've been reading kind of dispersely, but I think Roziak's work is really good at framing a lot of these things in terms that are close to us. And that reminds me of some of his ways of kind of articulating stuff in his work. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Awesome. Yeah, but
So
I love this. This is really cool. And then yeah, to show that this adjoint, I'm just going to the very bottom, like this CRW and then the IRW, it's like those are taking, like, if you scroll back up a little bit, I don't know if I can do the annotations, but like CR is actually in this direction, right? And then IR is this, maybe I'll use a different color, but let's do IR as red, right? So this is IR. So CR and IR are composite maps that take the world back to itself. So if we're talking about the world as like real constraints, right? So we have like you said, the real constraints of the world are bounded by the left and right here. So by this double mapping, right?
Yeah.
Which doesn't get you back to the same place necessarily, right? If I get reduced and then I map back to the interaction, map back via the interactions, I'm not going to get to the same place as if I reduce myself and then map towards via the constraint arrow. So yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about this, what we call like social mediation, in this 1 equals 3 follow 2. But yeah, I still know exactly what these two things are. Like I was thinking about that. I know you had mentioned you had you put it in terms of like an ideological gap in the world, right? But I wasn't really sure if I understood this. I was just thinking more of the formal, like that you would go one direction then back to the world and get to a different place. Okay.
Yeah, I think.
So John,
Oh.
go ahead.
Well, I think like, yeah, I mean, I think you know, when I'm up here with this is like, this kind of makes a more easily intuitive sense because it's just one arrow. But I think it's one of those things, right? Like if this is a correct interpretation, then this follows. So then the question is how do we interpret that if we agree with this? And so I think one of the things that's interesting here is like with this, we've like fully removed individual or the space of reasons in this case from the constraint in a sense. We can reason without needing to like deal with it, you know, categorically, like we don't have to quote look inside now. And so I think that's like one way to frame like what are like I'm not quite sure how to answer exactly what these are, but that's kind of the problem. How I formulate the problem is it gives us a way to understand when we look at the world, the constraints of the world without having to look at any particular individual or any particular group to do so.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. It's like,
But what that means is still yeah, is part of why I'm bringing it to the group. Gabriel.
Yeah, I think that I mean, if the thing that we discussed at the end of last meeting makes sense, meaning that there is a memory evolutive systems based interpretation that is helping us move the socially mediated diagram to something slightly more sturdy and substantial. Because you did something here, which I think it's symptomatic of the problems of the mediation, which is it was better to reframe the constraints arrow as composition. That says something. That's not, I mean, I think it aligns things with an intuition that originally the reason why they were, I'm just starting from here, but I'll get to the point. Like originally the reason why we wrote it like this, right? You have something here, let's say it interacts this way and it's constrained in this way. It's because we use the idea that interactions go one way and constraints go the other to define reduction as the difference between the two, which is actually like in dynamic kind of cybernetic kind of approach, you will call this like, well, the break-in expectation, the error margin, and so on, those things are the things you build your world out of in terms of how you portray it, right? If everything you do gets you exactly what you want, you can't really build it's like a reality testing, right? Where it fails, you learn something. And it does have a Bogdanovian feel where, what resists to labor is knowledge about the world. It's the basis for knowledge. So that's good on one hand, but it's problematic on another, which I think it's why it makes sense what you did, which is like when I say S, like a set constrains an element, what do I exactly mean? Whereas, right, when I do exactly what you did, like I have an element and I say it's composing S, yes, I get what it means, right? And we know that in the social mediations diagram, the constraint arrow is actually following a kind of basic idea of composition. The world is bigger than mediations, which are bigger than individuals. So there should be almost like a belonging arrow this way. It would be obvious for everyone that singleton belongs to a subset, not a basic subset which belongs to the set, right? As the singleton belongs to the set, or something like this, right? Or it's included, to be more precise. But anyway, so there is something you did which I think it's telling first, which is, well, but picturing constraints going the other way in terms of this is the material of that. This is included in that. Seems easier, and that's a question for later. But I wanted to know if I'm not. I mean, you would still have adjoints written like this, right? Interactions going this way, reduction coming this way, and composition and constraints coming this way as well. If this would get in the way of the definitions, I imagine that it wouldn't, because the semantics for this would be just the inverse of composition in your sense, like very, very trivially, right? But yeah, so that's one point. But then I think that the core point is that if I'm saying this because it looks like the definition of composition is symptomatic in the sense that we're still figuring it out, but it is the core point, because that graph-based description where, let's say, we define individual to be, rather than a thing, which I think it's always a problem for us, individual is just the name of what constitutes a social atom, right? It's the minimal mediation, the minimal thing that counts as a social point of view. So at this level, you have all these things interacting, right? And we can define the moving above to the realm of mediations simply by the co-limits of these graphs. Well, if this thing here establishes a relation with every other atom such that it is the thing through which you see all these things, right? Then it counts as a mediation, and you're on your way for building more of those. But there will always be just special interactions. They're not qualitatively different things. So for example, I wouldn't call what's at this levels something like the space of reasons, because I think it reproduces the idea that the individual level is kind of qualitatively different. It's the level of interiority, of personal psychology or richness, rather than simply the set of small stuff that socially works. Like and it makes sense. The space of social reasons, it's kind of the space of very small social justifications for socially effective behavior. Why did you raise your hand to stop the cab? Because it works. But it doesn't work because of physics, right? It works because the guy will be out of a job if he doesn't stop, and he'll be poor and not pay his bills if he doesn't stop for you. So it is kind of, you could explain it that way and use the pragmatism of the space of reasons, right? To account for something individual, but you're ultimately also talking about interactions that work, right? So I'm just saying all of this because it sounds like it's a language or a way of approaching that might help clarify and help us find examples, because it feels to me that makes it even clearer what you're talking about. Like, there is a very special relation between but then I think it's perhaps I'm pushing it, but it's almost like there is like the composition arrow. For us, it's kind of like a special bundle of interactions. Like it's the individual composes into the world only insofar as it can be seen by special parts it interacts with, right? By the stuff that function as colimits for these subgraphs. So the composition arrow going up, to me, it sounds like how to put it, like yeah, it's constrained in the sense that, well, if you don't behave in that way, it's not effective, right? You won't belong, right? You will actually, you cannot belong even in terms of dying, right? Whereas the interaction one seems to be anything you do that is not touching on that factor, right? Something like this. Yeah,
Man, we scared Raphael out.
I mean, I know what happened, man. He's Monday. He comes. He takes like 3 hours of bus to get back home from work.
Oh,
And
dang. Okay.
getting home like just at our meeting time. I know. I imagine he's.
Oh,
he has
gotcha.
a headache.
Gotcha. Okay. No, I think those are all really good points. And I think yeah, I think that there's some, yeah, I think your point is well taken on I as the space of reasons, and I think maybe that's one way to actually flesh out what these arrows might be, because I think in a way you could almost say that, like, for example, this right here is actually more like the space of reasons as it's presented as like socially socially reasonable things you can do in the world, right? And over here you could say that this is like socially maybe not reasonable, what's the word that would be, like things that make sense, or that like the space of things that like make sense as like you point to it and say this is a brick in a building or something. I'm having a hard time with words at the moment, but if this is like all the actions you can do that make sense, these are the names. There we go. We could say this is basically like the names of things you can point at and say this is a part of the world, right? And one of the things I'll go into more down the road once at another presentation in math, but the naming thing is really important here because constants play are this arrow in a lot of the logic, right? So, and of course, names are where Badu gets a lot of work done too. So we could say in a way that what this does here is it gives us the kind of limits of the body of knowledge that Badu talks about, right? Like these are the ways that things are named, whether they're the names of the actual parts or the names of like the legitimate actions in a society. And I think it's interesting also to consider that this split here, like when we're considering like the semantics of this, if we look at this in terms of the composition, and we could also see like this arrow back from the world doesn't have to be like, again, it can be going into part like subsets or chunks basically of pieces here. So we could think of this, for example, this arrow coming back as the way the world is composed based upon the way the world was reduced. And when we ask how it was reduced, we could definitely say, well, in capitalist society, it was reduced based upon how much value could be extracted out of it. So we could say that the world, when we consider how it's composed for the purposes of making money for extracting value, that world will, when we understand that as the world, that world is the basis from which that's the understanding from which we can understand how the world gets bigger. In other words, we could see this as the formal description of what forces of production means, because this would be precisely how the world is composed in such a way that it's able to produce more. But as we know, forces of production always exceed their parts. It gets bigger. So what is it that binds the world at the same time? It's all those same the world reduced down based upon value, and then all the interactions that are done to maintain that value. In other words, we could look at that as something like the relations of production. So I think this is important because it speaks to Gabriel's point. Like we shouldn't be like we regardless of how we interpret I, we shouldn't be making this about individuals, because we could look at this as like all the ways that the world is broken up in such a manner and then recomposed for value, all the ways the world is broken up and then acted upon and interacted with for value.
Yeah, for example,
So
just a suggestion, just to conclude on this point, like what based on what Dennis just said, right? That the way that they are described, the two adjoints in that mereology paper are as kind of defining us quantifiers, right? So for example, say you have something like this, okay? A bunch of arrows between these things, like these are three workers, right? And they have a bunch of arrows between them. And this is another worker, but who is the supervisor? How do we know it is the supervisor? It has arrows to all of them, right? So while they have like a bunch of arrows between them, they all have arrows coming from this one position. Well, this arrow here is a particular arrow. Like you can't generalize anything from it. You can only say that there is this arrow, right? Whereas for every one of the workers, if they are part of this mediation, so if they compose the mediation, for all of them, there will be this arrow here. So it does seem like going upwards to the composition has some relation with for all the things that belong to that mediation. Whereas interactions, which are relations within a certain level, right? There are interactions. So we might be able to map like particulars to interactions and universals to mediations, right?
No, I think so. I think very much so. Yeah.
Okay. No, because then I think
totally agree. And that paper was a big inspiration for this whole thing.
Okay.
Honestly,
no, because then I think it really puts us on the way to like really taking that work on adjoints, and it clarifies for me, right, what you're saying, because it also means like interactions, they do come in the form of particulars, and you do need to mobilize reasons for your particular actions, right? But the quality of those particular actions are given by a orthogonal axis, which has to do with the social construction, which is invariant for those actions in a way. Like you can still have some degree of freedom in that level, right? So yeah, no, it just clarifies something I'm not sure if it makes sense like technically, but at least as a kind of heuristics, I think it makes both things qualitatively the same while keeping them separate.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think there's probably, I think you could, for example, make a case for the other direction, what I've called ideology. Someone might say, well, actually, that's the right way to do it, and this is backwards. Someone might say, like, well, rearrange the arrows. Like, the point is less that, like, I think this is the final way to do it, and more that I think this is the way to do it overall, the direction we need to go.
But it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense.
So, and actually, Spong and Fivac are excellent as well, because where they introduce quantification is also where they introduce predication and constraints. And so here we can talk about, especially with R, right? This is where we can start talking about the modes, because we're going to be asking, like, how do we understand, or what is it that when we reduce a world down, what is it we're sensing from the world? The way we sense that is through these different topological semantics. And there's probably also ways to interpret the I and C. I just haven't thought about that as much. But I am going to jump over to my very poorly drawn monster, which, oh, dear God, did I not even take the whole screenshot? Oh, God. Oh, no, that's right. That's just that. Okay. But it turns out Guitar's essay is freaking paywalled, and I couldn't find where I had the PDF. But I really needed the original arrows, because we took out the arrows in the monster. And I needed the arrows. So the question then becomes, okay, let's just say for the time being that this is all right. I've nailed it first time.
Download it here from the chat. I have it here.
Oh, okay. I've already got this here. You all are just gonna have to deal. I do apologize. But I'm gonna be. Can you see that? Is it legible?
Mhm.
Okay. Then we're gonna go with this. So the reason I wanted to have these though is these arrows here are significant. So I'll come back to them in just a second. But the question then becomes, okay, so if this is the correct way to kind of conceive how a world is constrained and remains social, without any politics, then the question is, okay, how is that world interacted in? How is it composed? How is it reduced when we have these modes and we have a definition of the world as being this Borromean world made up of these modes, right? So we need to have a way, in other words, to kind of use the modes to flesh out what this means right here. And I think Spong and Fivak is a very good way to look at that, because the first part of their paper looks at like an algebra of parts. How can you break something down in terms of parts? But then after they've established that, they then and this is where the quantification stuff Gabriel was just talking about, then they talk about what are the constraints that parts pass to one another. And so the question would be, in this sense, when we look at any part of our social world, what constraints based upon modes A, B, and C are acting on that object at that time, right? So if I steal an apple from the store and I get caught with it in my hand, that object is predominantly appearing at that moment under mode B, in a sense, right? Like whatever else that object means, it is now probably going to rot in evidence, right? It is not going, it's lost all of its exchange value. Or if that exchange value has any meaning, it's now been ascribed to a punishment that I have to pay or something like that, right? That same apple, if I got away with it and I brought it to someone who was hungry, would then be a gift which, precisely because it was stolen, would further increase the value of that gift as a gift, right? It would indicate a greater degree of affinity for that person, right? And so what would it mean, for example, in that case, for the value of, I say value generally as opposed to value for C, but like the
worth.
amount that, yeah, the amount of affinity in a gift, right? We could say, how is that constrained by mode B in that case? Likewise, if I went out and bought an apple, but it was a very rare apple, it had been imported, and I gave that, mode C would then be passing on a certain kind of constraint to the meaning of that object as a gift, right? So, and we can do this in lots of different directions, right? And this, for example, happens with a lot of struggles around, enclosure of the commons and indigenous land. When a piece of land that has been encoded for centuries or millennia as belonging to mode A is suddenly cut off and separated and reinterpreted as value, it's often not some it's not like it is one thing and then it becomes something else. A lot of the things that were encoded as meaningful remain meaningful for capitalist exploitation, right? Like, so for example, you might have a creek going through a piece of land that has just been enclosed. That creek was a place where certain kinds of community interactions occurred. There were stories around that, memories around that, certain myths that formed around that. Those same stories and myths may very well play into how that land is turned into something for profit, right? Like, you may end up building like a little inn there, have a little bed and breakfast, and then rent it out. And those stories become part of the commodified process, right? But the very thing that people want, that they're paying for in that, is the significance of those things as mode A, right? So if we want to treat these constraints as logics that have strict semantics based on topology, and I'll review all that here in just a second. We need to not only be able to describe how each of these transcendentals go into a world, but once they're in a world, how they interact with one another. The how and the details of that is something that, like, I'm trying to set up the space to figure that out. I do not have an answer. If I had an answer, I would be getting paid much more as a professional person that does great, brilliant things with numbers. But like, what is, I think, the case is that, like, we can set up the problems in such a way that we can make them mathematically tractable. Like, we can say, this is what has to be solved to solve our problem, but this is what has to be solved mathematically. And so that translates into, how do we interact with these? I'll zoom in a bit more. And there we go. These are our three modes right here, right? How do I get rid of that? Does it go away? No? Okay, cool. I don't know. Yeah, it's mostly. So how do these three kinds of things, these three kinds of topologies, interact in any given place inside of a social world? So, I'm gonna drink some water real quick and take a second. Yeah. Yeah, I'll just go. I'll actually clarify this because I think it'll be more conceptually clear the other direction. So I'll come back to that in just a second. So I'll just go ahead and make my case now for mode B, my definitions and stuff. Sorry, I know this is a little bit loose, but it's what I could get together. And I want to lay this out because I do think these are things we need to figure out for the book. So I wanted to get the conversation going. So, even if this is kind of vague, I do think at least it gets the ideas out there. So mode B, and you can kind of see this here, right? Mode A is what we call like closed borders, right? It's got these, like, any space has borders around it. Definitively when you're here, and then when you're outside. You can be right there or you can be outside. Now, in B's, you can be both. You can be on the border, which technically means you're both inside and you're outside, but you're able to distinguish between those three. You can be outside, you can be inside, or you can be both. With this, you don't have a nice, neat place where you're suddenly outside. You can approximate it, but you'll just find yourself outside at some point. And then the other way, you'll be outside and you'll kind of head towards that, and you won't be outside, and then you'll gradually be inside, but you won't exactly know when that'll be either. So in other words, these are like fuzzy lines right here. But you always know that you're inside or that you're outside. You just don't know when. Here, you do know when, but you can't distinguish when you're on this border. With Boolean logic, or classical logic, you get to have both. You get to know when you go inside and outside, and you get to know whether or not you're inside or outside. So that gives us, useful information as far as that's concerned. But the problem is, and this is one of the areas I'd wished I'd had more time to flesh out, because I'm going to say this without being able to really go into much detail. Topologists don't care about this very much. It's not interesting. These two are where all the interesting things happen. And I've been thinking about this in terms, again, of sound design. So that's the only real analogy I have here, but I think it's a useful one. So when you're trying to make a cool synth sound, you can take something that's got lots going on, but may not be very pleasant to listen to. You could, for example, record an HVAC system blowing air through a building. It doesn't have anything that's particularly aesthetically appealing, but if you were to look at the sound wave, every single frequency has got a lot going on. It's got a lot of information inside of that. One of the main kinds of synthesis is called subtractive synthesis, which is where you actually pull frequencies out or lower certain frequencies in order to retain just a piece of the overall information that actually gets you what you want. That principle is then like taken even to the next step whenever you're mixing tracks, right? You might take a bass and cut some of the mid-range frequencies so that your guitar sounds really clean. But then you may take the drums and cut out its lowest frequencies so that the bass comes through clearly, right? So in order to get information either into a state that you want, like when you're trying to get this perfect synth sound, or when you have a bunch of different things and you need to combine them together and you want them to still be clear, you actually get more of what you're looking for by taking out information. And so what open and closed sets do is they extract a lot of different parts, different ways you could look at something. And in doing so, you're able to detect all kinds of interesting information, right? Like it's taken for granted, and every single, stupid Disney movie about like the bad guy that comes along and ruins the community and then they're gonna fight back and blah blah blah. Like it's nothing radical to say that like capitalists don't get community, right? Our point is actually that that's precisely the strength of capitalism, right? It's not like, oh, they're making money and they happen to not understand how communities work, right? Like the very thing that makes it possible to extract productivity, to recompose spaces in a way that maximizes productive capacities is filtering out all of this information, all of this complexity, all of this weird border stuff. Likewise, when you're trying to, for example, if anyone's ever had like multiple friend groups and you're trying to have a party and you're trying to bring them together and they're different and you don't really know how everything's going to jive and whatnot, you don't necessarily want to hone in on like all the individual little things, all the individual little pieces, right? You want to actually know which friend is in which friend group so that you can kind of figure out like, okay, my metal friends want this kind of music going. My like vegan friends need to have this food there. You need to actually be able to distinguish the boundaries in order to be able to problem solve in such a way that you can kind of like know who's who and what's what. So you're able to kind of like get more with less from these two open sets. But there's a fundamental problem with both of these that you get with this guy, which, if you'll see, is always going to be in an interaction between something that doesn't have a boundary and something that does have a boundary. Or if we're going to look at intervals, which I haven't even touched on yet, but oh no, it deleted it. That's supposed to be a dot there as well. Dang it. Oh well, I'll fix it later. Imagine another circle. This is supposed to be a boundary on both sides, no boundaries, and a boundary on only one side. Thank you. In this case, you only get one or the other, and that'll be important here in a second. But what do you get with mode B? Mode B is everything. Like the model for mode B is what's the power set. The power set is all the subsets. And without going too far into like the math, that essentially means that in order for a logic to be Boolean, in order for it to be able to definitively say whether you're inside and outside every single time, whether you're on the boundary or not every single time, you actually have to have all the information about. You have to have available to you all the ways to break up your set into all of its parts. You have to be able to have all the information available of how things kind of fit together. And that is a problem if you are a capitalist only concerned with like your one little niche, or you're part of a community that's only concerned with like the limited groups of people in your community. But there's one particular area that we know of that does require that you know all the parts in order to be able to come up with anything at all, which is the regulatory dimension. And that's precisely why I'm going to move on to control and protocol. The thing that's essential coming out of this is that because there's a not something without a boundary and something with a boundary, mode B is technically considered clopen, which is a word mathematicians actually came up with and used. And essentially what that means is that any single closed space, any open space you can find, will always be a subset of a Boolean logic. There's always a Boolean logic that can be had over the entire world. I can elaborate what that means in
Did I
John
drop?
disconnected.
Oh, I think John.
Yeah.
It was just getting to like the really cool stuff.
Yeah, this is amazing.
This is
I have to
really-
go, but I really wanted to see where John was going.
Ah, he's back.
Welcome.
Let me just redo.
Oh, did I drop
this.
out? Okay.
Yeah,
Weird.
for
It
a
was
second.
super quick. Oh, okay.
You need to reshare the screen though.
Yeah. Am I host still?
Yes.
Oh yeah. Cool. Okay. So yeah, so these are all arbitrary categories. They don't have to have anything to do with each other. But like I just said, modes A, B, and C actually have quite a bit to do with each other. And there's also ways that you can turn A and C into each other through complementation. The point being that they're very actually intertwined logics. They're not three entirely distinct things. Because of that, I think part of the problem we've had, and I would say even the history of theories of the state have had, has been to actually think of these three as completely separate. And this is actually why I think Karatani is only capable of conceiving of a purely negative mode B, because he attempts to conceive of it as something that's fully distinct from modes A and C. But actually, I think we can look at in a contravariant, that is to say opposite direction. We could look at control as a more abstract form, a lesser form, or something of affinity and value, in the sense that maybe I had these backwards. I don't even know anymore. But the point being that we could see that, for example, when we're trading a gift or when we are exchanging a commodity, in both cases, there are certain kinds of protocols that are or are not met. You either do negotiate and you exchange, whatever the price is met. Once you've negotiated that price is the final price, and you either pay it or you don't. There may be this ambiguous third term between a gift and a counter gift and like a strange excess, but you either do meet the threshold of like a successful counter gift or you do not. So there's a certain kind of way in which even within these non-Boolean logics, insofar as they meet some kind of intrinsic criteria, they either do or they don't meet that criteria.
Mhm.
I would also argue that when I say control, I want to use that in a very formal sense of the term. In the sense of like control logics, theories of control for mathematics. In other words, asking the question of what's the least I need to do to what things to get what outcome? And you could see affinity and value as attempts to probe spaces to answer that question. Yeah, actually, I think most of that will probably just leave to conversation. So just real quick, I'm just going to wrap up here, and then we can move into conversation because it's already gone long. I'm just going to quickly go through my critiques of the established terms, and where we can address any of these in conversation. And I've thought about four a lot. If I've missed others, let me know. Property, law, state, contract. So law, I imagine for similar reasons that we don't have like the critique of business or commerce. It's a very general term. It can mean a lot of things. It can mean
Can you
very
move the
specific
screen
things.
just for the list of the four things?
What was that?
Could you, because the screen is on the control and protocol. I know you have like a list.
Okay. Actually, I don't have the four things. Let me just put those down real quick.
Because I'm redoing your whole presentation on a different screen just so I can write my notes, so it would be helpful.
Nice. Property, law, state, contract. Okay. So yeah, so law I think is frankly it could work, but in the sense that we talk about like laws of science or like the laws of a protocol like HTTP or something. But it's also there's lots of other meanings of the term, so it's to me it's very vague. State, I'm okay with logic of the state in the same way that we say logic of capital, but we distinguish between capital and logics of value and commodity exchange as a higher order and more historically specific thing. And so that's part of why I think like I'm very critical of Karatani's negative notion of mode B, because it takes away any organizational value of mode B as a problem-solving logic. So obviously we want to get past the state, but for the same reason we want to get past capital. And I would argue against his like love of mode A, we want to get past racism and segregation and all that little nasty stuff too. Property I'll come back to in just a second. Contract I'm going to say is a Borromean object. And by that I mean it's an object that is generated as a way to actually in day-to-day life reproduce the synthesis of these three modes, right? Like I talked about, we need to be able to formally account for how they're tied together, but then we also need to be able to socially account for how they're aligned, right? Because we have a thesis of disalignment, misalignment. That means we also need to be able to account for how. A contract, first off, is a set of commodity exchanges, right? And I'm talking about like an actual contract. It may be one all at once, it may be over a period of years, it may be you get the thing and then you make payments, whatever it is, it's formalizing that. It is then also, and the primer gets into this, it creates on the register of mode A relationship of the creditor and the debtor, which has this kind of strange kind of like community logic insofar as like interest, for example, becomes like this strange like counter gift back and forth. And then ultimately, a contract either is or is not honored and therefore enforceable by the state. And this has been, like Aristophanes' play The Clouds, like lawsuits and contract violations have been one of the key things the state has always been involved in. It's not like some extra bureaucratic thing it does when it's not busy monopolizing violence. I would argue that actually in many ways, maintaining contracts is more state-like than the monopoly on violence, which being here in the United States, the U.S. government has never had a monopoly on violence. We've always had shit tons of populist terroristic violence, and yet the United States state is one of the most effective nation states to have ever stated. So that was a weird one. All right, and then finally property. And this is the one that I think well, actually that's why I drew this diagram in the first place. So, and this is the one place I want to push back upon a particular argument in I think it's the Social Worlds one, which characterized mode B as having no boundary, which I think I know where that came from, but it doesn't apply in this model. In this model, mode C has no boundary, mode A has both boundaries, and mode B, only one of those things has boundaries. So I would argue that from the perspective of the state, the canonical notion of boundary is the frontier, right? And we can think about this as like the most famous border of all time historically, which is the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China belongs to China. It does not sit in between China and the barbarian north or what have you. It is definitively belongs to China. the anxiety that was correctly pointed out about the nation state in, oops, sorry, didn't mean to get all angelic on y'all.
You're being brilliant, so it's
um, but but the anxiety of a lack of border, I actually think, is what has happened as a result of what Lenin and Bukharin drew attention to in their analysis of imperialism. We ran out of space. Once you ran out of space for the expansion of capitalism, there was no longer any outside for there to be a border that is just belonging to one side. Once you have nation states, everything is a shared border. And precisely because everything is a shared border under capitalism, there aren't really any strong borders to be had, right? And this is precisely the contradiction that Bukharin starts out imperialism and world economy between nation state capital, which is constantly competing with one another, and a global international system in which there are, strictly speaking, no actual boundaries, right? And so you actually have this kind of weird flickering state almost, where there is a boundary that is shared and a boundary that almost doesn't exist. And when Mode B attempts to reassert itself, as we're seeing, for example, in the case of the Egyptian side of the occupiers' border right now, in which they're essentially trying to treat it as their border, that is separate from Egypt. It is, currently that is one of the many things that have been pointed out as a violation of international law. Because in order for nation states to function, you have to treat the boundaries as being shared. So I would argue that property, as we understand it, is actually something that exists at the intersection of these different ways of drawing these boundaries. And in a way, it's a result of the problem precisely of the multiplicity thesis, that because property, and I think there's actually ways to tie this to some of the stuff you're working on, environmental logic, that land can carry all, it can be a material support for all of the modes. And because it can be a material support for all of the modes, property itself can kind of shift. You can buy and sell property, you can give property, property can be protected by the state, but it also kind of can somewhat, in a weird kind of way, be none of them or all of them at the same time. So, and there's the actual atomic logic, which doesn't really say much more than that it's binary, and these are the ways you can turn logics into the other two logics into them, which isn't super relevant at the moment. But yeah, I think that it's pretty usual. It's kind of scattered and all over the place, but I think that there's a cogent approach there.
Scared and all over the place at all.
So yeah, I'll wrap there, and I don't know if folks want to take a break or whatnot.
I'm up for starting the discussion already, but I'm not sure what Monica and Moritz want. If you guys want 5 minutes.
Oh, did we lose Dennis too? Dang. Okay.
Yeah, I think Moritz says it's fine to start as well.
All right, cool.
No, because just to kick it off, like, I'm the first thing I wanted to tell you, man, is you need to message Alan. I'm not sure if you spoke to him, but it's crazy.
He's the one that did the power presentation, right?
Yeah.
Way back when. Yeah.
Because when he came to Rio, his presentation in our little national conference was a critique of Mode B as a separate thing, and in a way that it's very similar to what you're saying. And we had a conversation that helped a lot, because I think that I put it in this way. Let's see if you agree with this. Like, I feel like there is a consensus already that we're trying to move away from, let's say, a consensus on two things. First, that that Mode B is the one that suffers, not only in our group, but in theory in general. It's something you said in your presentation. It just suffers from a kind of very weird way of being developed. and usually takes the modern state to be the basis of state. It's like the least sophisticated people will just take the modern state to be the state in general and generalize it. The slightly more sophisticated will take like feudalism and, you know, absolute monarchies or whatever, and empires to be the form, and then generalize that. And it just gives you that idea of states as being this rigid, solid, bureaucratic, sturdy, hierarchical thing with no flexibility and so on. And I remember very well, we always talk about this, the moment that we'd be, by talking to you and the things you were bringing, especially after the presentation on the Mongolian Empire, this was starting to shift as, okay, this cannot be the basis where we start from at all. So I think that there's an agreement on that. And then there was a second movement, which I think once we started treating these logics more clearly, we got the basis for that intuition that the general theory was wrong, because we cannot treat the logic of mode B as being, it can be the simpler in a sense that, oh, it's classical logic, it's simpler whatever way you want to say, because 99% of mathematics was built on that. So I mean, it sounds pretty powerful to me, but it is a subcase of the other two. So that places it as an internal thing that you really don't need any external sui generis exceptional resource to explain. It sounds like whatever else you get, you're getting this, right? So there is a weird and cool nexus where A and C seem to be inverted versions of each other. Meets and joints are inverted, which is borderline trivial for mathematicians. Like, fuck it, who gives a shit closed versus open? They are the same, right? It's the Office meme. You show the two and they say, I don't see any difference. But to make it even worse, not only don't they see a difference, but mode B is included in both of them. So it's like an indifferent part of an indifferent composite, right? So it just goes to show, I think you're the first time we ever made this claim, you made it now, like, yes, A, B, and C, but they're very interconnected as logics, even before we put all these arrows towards the world. Like, so I think that's fundamental. But then that set up a second consensus, which I think is one that we've developed in the last year, which is that you need to start from B by realizing that it is the most plastic mediation. Like, if it has this stern aspect of, you know, belonging, either it does or it doesn't. At the same time, you can find it anywhere. So it's a double-edged sword that gives it a very special kind of flavor to it, because you can, as long as you can establish that division of belongs or doesn't, and it is ubiquitous, you're ready to go, right? So it's anywhere. Then it comes a third point, which I think is where the new dissensus is on how to define it. I'm just starting backwards from the let's say the candidates for starting point for mode B, which I totally agree. I don't think we've been speaking of contracts very much these days. The state, I think it would be, we've been making so much effort to treat it as a historically specific thing that would be just backwards to treat it as a center thing. The law, I agree. I mean, you can just track the history of the law unless you accept it as the most vague term for big rules, and then it doesn't sound like it's good enough. But then you're challenging property, and from your presentation, it was clear to me that there is a point that justifies revisiting the social world's draft, but perhaps not for the reason you're saying. So that's what I wanted. I'm giving all this background to establish where we are on the same page and where I'm not sure.
Okay.
Because I think that the idea of the use of doesn't have a boundary. The asterisk that should explain it is, if you define boundary specifically as what is the shared limit of two closed sets. In that sense,
yeah.
you can
That's
have,
what I was wondering if it was
have
from the coating perspective.
Yeah. Once you define it as simply having a limit, you know, then it does. You can have a set with a boundary. There's no problem there. And you can even go very far. You won't be able to totally exclude a classical complement, a situation where you will have a clopen relation, right? This has a limit and its complement doesn't. You might go very far into giving the limit of everything. In fact, for example, being able to clearly establish these kind of regions, but then the set of all set, like the smallest and the largest will still have open complements, right? So you won't be able to escape it somewhere. But the core thing you just said that I think it's really crucial, but I wonder if it connects back to the beginning, which is property. Mode B is actually the only, let's say, non-symmetric one. Like what the idea of a cut, which we proposed, which is like, let's call it a one-sided limit, right? I think what made property a cool term to start from is that it is the definition of anything that has a one-sided limit is a property. Like you can give a cool definition of what properties mean that way, because any wall that belongs to the thing it's walling, but doesn't belong to the thing that is walled out, define the property. And that can be both logically and physically. Like if I can tell you, don't trespass, and that don't trespass is mine, it belongs to the thing not to be trespassed, that's a property. And even an object treated in such a way as its limits are part of that object and it's totally separated from its environment, that's also a property. But that's not the whole picture, and you brought the whole picture into play now, because I think this idea of a flickering one-sided limit, it's important, because that idea is incomplete. If there is a one-sided limit, that means there is a one-sided lack of limit, right? And I think it's something that's much more profound than just saying, well, one side has a limit and the other doesn't. It's saying, okay, but therefore I can come at these things from both sides, right? Because, for example, going back to the idea of environment, that means that the environment of mode B is the only environment where, for example, you can see this as a really clear example. You can define property as a resource taken, but you wouldn't define the place you took the resource from with the same terms as the property. It is, let's say, this kind of limitless thing, right? So you need to talk about both sides to talk about the state, right? You need to talk both about, and I think that clarifies something that it was hard for us to describe. Perhaps our ambivalence about how to start with mode B. It's not only because it is a sub logic of other logics, which makes it like we always already started, but also because we never get to choose, like, is it violence or social pacts? No, but it's both, because the one-sided limit is the social pact, right? But what is the boundless thing we left on the other side? That's violence. It's property because it has a limit that defines its boundary, but it's the place of just availability, right? Which is where property is extracted from. So you don't get to choose because it's the only asymmetric mode. And it feels like every time we chose something, well, but the inverse of that thing, which has a different quality, is not just more of the same. Why shouldn't we have started with that? So I think the way you're presenting it is also clarifying that there's something about the idea of cut that sounds too symmetric.
Yeah.
It's a cut, like between the past and the present. Yeah, but the present and the past don't exist the same for the state. Right? Like when I say such a date is the date, whatever comes before and whatever comes after that cut don't have the same quality. One will be the closed, one will be the open. So it implies a heterogeneity of qualities in that sense that I think I wasn't clear on that until now. And I think that speaks to why it's a third criteria. Like if we're just logically describing this thing, mode B, it's part of every logic. secondly, it has this weird kind of commonality between creating, I just said, like a one-sided aspect to something, a one-sided limit to something, but it has a third property, which is it is asymmetric. Like the moment you define what's inside this one limit, you created trouble of, okay, but now you have this infinite approximation, this almost weird kind of complement to it, right? It's negative. Like the negative is not settled because of this, and I think that's what gives it its Hegelian flavor. I think that's what makes it kind of interesting, because then you need, for example, how do you extract a resource, you create property out of this resourceful space. Kind of now you need to invert the picture to treat the resourceful place as a property, because you've just created something which is now limitless by complement. So you need the flickering to hierarchically construct a space where you're not just extracting this thing's well-defined. Well, but the complement of this well-defined, clearly bound thing is something without a boundary. So you see my point? Like it allows us to define an instability that is proper to mode B that I think was missing, and that is a good justification to why there's something about the word property that doesn't capture that. Like in my mind, property did capture it, but only because I was very taken by the idea that fucking hell, the classic negation, the relation between a closed segment and an open one, it's the basis for the idea of alienation. If I cannot take the boundary together with what I remove, I cannot alienate the thing. But that actually suggests alienation might be better than property, right? In the sense not necessarily of being removed from yourself or being kind of blinded or whatever, but just in the sense that it is a logic of taking the boundary with something and therefore leaving the other part without it, right? So that's where I'm unclear how you see things, because that's something that is singular to mode B. And on the one hand, I think you're pushing for that singularity. But on the other hand, because the first clause we learned is that it is a sublogic to the other ones, you might overemphasize that, well, when you restrict things to this smaller logic, you get this powerful mediating tool. But from this perspective of alienation, it comes with a great cost as well. So it does acquire a singularity. See my point? So if you only take the first thesis, like the first two theses, we are not taking the theory of the state. Mode B is actually a subcase of the other two. You could just conclude it is the most plastic kind of, it's like this thing inside of every other logic. If you take the thesis tree, which says, okay, it's a sub-logic to other logics, but the cost for that is now you're stuck with classical complements. You're stuck with negation, with the strongest negation. You're stuck with a negation that can prove infinity, transfinite numbers. The other two don't give a fuck about it. Like they either consider it ridiculous or trivial, right? So you set up the stakes for infinity to be relevant or thinkable. Like it's you do get an additional thing that you weren't expecting, which is this asymmetry.
Yeah.
Right. So I wonder if you think this is enough of a qualification to say, well, it is a mediation, but then it will still require. I mean, it does sound to me like a really good justification of why we always introduce state measures to facilitate the negotiation between A and C. And then it just introduces so many internal problems that you need the states to put the state in check, you know? Sorry, just cut off.
Sorry. Yeah. It just introduces what? What was
Yeah,
that
like,
last little bit?
my point is you bring the state logic in to mediate. That you cut off again. The moment it's really trying not to come across. See if it comes back. Hey John, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back. There we go. At least it's logging me back in quick now. So
Yeah, I think it's the CIA just trying to prevent us from arriving.
yeah,
I was just
exactly.
gonna say, like, my interpretation, my kind of analogy for this is that you introduce the state. Always, it's easy to introduce it because it's a good tool to negotiate, control, and create protocols for negotiating between mode A and C. But once it's introduced, it also introduces a new problem because it just introduces an asymmetry that didn't exist. And it's impossible to say this to John. I'll write it. I'll fuck it. I'll write it to him after. But I'm not sure if that makes sense to you, man. Like, or if I'm just going on a weird route with all of this. Now that I know you're in the lattice jungle.
I think as I got that you always like have two solutions for resolving the border, and that you can like switch the perspective somehow between what is property and what is frontiers or like wilderness. So what I got was that, like, when you talked about this flickering, that it's like the shifting between what is property and what is the outside.
I really like that idea. I think that, did you say wilderness?
Yeah.
That's a really good term. I think that would be a really cool kind of way of approaching this. You know, Rafael is reading a book now called Nature's Evil, which is just a history of the relation between nature and the state. And part of the argument of the book, it's pretty much this, that like, once you have an extractive relation with nature, that somehow is also what creates the counterpoint that there is this boundless weird thing on the other side. No, like the discourse about who created nature is, and therefore, like, what's its purpose? Is it bound by rules? It's kind of a side effect of using nature to create stuff, you know, in this kind of rule-based way. So I don't know. I like the idea that you kind of create a sense of wilderness outside of property by this very same act that creates property, you know?
All right. Probably just gonna have to leave here soon. My internet's just so fucking janky all of a sudden. But I'm gonna try to just answer. Actually said what the problem was. It blocked out. But I think actually part of the thing we should explore though here is the contravariance, because it's correct. Yes, Boolean logics are subsets of these hating and cohating objects. But once we translate them into topologies, it's the So I think that that's the thing that is like needing to be explored, is that the logics are somehow kind of like like they're always contained, they're always present. You can always like have access to that logic, but the space is always kind of contained by that same, right? Like I think that's the weird kind of back and forth. That from a spatial perspective, the state always kind of contains everything.
Mhm.
And there's something in there that I think touches on this kind of asymmetry you're talking about. I don't know what that is, but I think that's I think that's an interesting place to explore it. And that's where Sheafs, you know, like they leverage precisely that distinction in how restrictions work and stuff like that. So that I think that'd be an interesting place to ask that question.
Yeah, because I think that Maurice said something now that was really good, because it sounds like there is this, perhaps we can call it a contravariant or something kind of operation where property and wilderness, they are born together. Like that's a really good way of thinking about this asymmetry, you know, like you constitute the outside as something that has no limit the moment that you create a state-like limit. And then you might need to remap the situation from the other side to make do with that. So you create that problem, you know?
I think so. Y'all are just cutting out so much. I think I'm just gonna have to bail.
Man, we can
Unfortunately.
pick this up. No, don't worry. You're gonna present more anyway, and I'm gonna write my argument for you on the mode B thing because I think that I really wanted to hear your points.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, no, let's do that, and then I'll take like the next. Try to do it now because I also had a question about the control versus protocol idea you had, which I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I think a lot of the points you were saying make a lot of sense and are going the direction. So yeah. Well, thank you all so much. I really have well, anyway, I really appreciate y'all like bearing with my presentation today.
Man,
So
it was
thank you.
great. I'm sorry for the CIA trying to get in our way, but
That's how we know we're doing good work, though. That's how we
exactly.
know.
Exactly.
Right? They're scared now. We're starting
And
to figure out
please-
the state. They're like, fuck these guys. They're trying to figure us out. So
and please schedule the next one soon, man, so we can pick this up.
yeah, I really want to actually present on Levere himself. So that might be my next thing. So we'll
Cool.
finally get into the crazies, man. So all right,
Yeah,
y'all.
man, but this was great.
Thank you very much. Take care. Have a good one.
Yeah.